What I'd like to do is throw out a few questions to the panel that we've been collecting from the audience. And maybe, Andy, since you have been speaking most recently, you could take a first crack at this first one. I'll date myself, but I graduated from medical school in 1990, and no one talked about the costs of therapy back then. You've heard, the introduction of concepts like the financial toxicity of treatment, and I know you think a lot about how to balance these issues. And so one question is, as we look at how the IRA could be modified, how it could be fixed, what can we hope for? What should we be trying to do to modify existing policies to better represent the best interests of patients?
It's a really good question, and it's so hard to fix something once it's passed. It would have been so much easier for the administration to listen to all of us stakeholders before the IRA came into play. But what has to be fixed for me first, and I'll leave that to the industry folks and to the economic experts here on this webinar. But for me, what has to be fixed is anything that stifles innovation. Whether it's the number of years of protection or whether it's just getting rid of the whole negotiation idea that you could actually negotiate with the United States government. That has to go because, number one, it's not a negotiation. It's not transparent. It's misleading. And really that provision for me is the scariest one of all of them, because when I meet with 26 pharma companies and I hear the same thing from every one of them, I don't think it's an idle threat. I think there actually is measurable pullback that is happening now across the board. And I think one of the big issues is that there's a lack of transparency in this entire IRA. There's not been a way for patients and patient voices to get involved in the policy discussion. There is not a transparency about how these prices are going to be negotiated. And there just has been a total lack of transparency across the board. And I think if you want the public to weigh in, it can't be on the sound bites that we hear in political speeches and on television. It has to be, it has to be measurable progress. And I don't think we're going to see that with the IRA. I think we're going to see measurable pullback from the industry, which is going to mean less drugs for patients. And there has to be, a more open way for patients to get involved. There is a way for patients to get involved and get the voice, but it's very complicated and complex. And it doesn't even appear that they'll take those viewpoints into account. That's kind of why we filed this lawsuit, was the lack of transparency that the administration had, and the lack of patient input and public input in getting this law passed. But those are my initial thoughts, but I'll turn it over to the experts here to fully respond to what can we do to fix this.
And Steve, can I just kind of build off of what Andy said and allude back to something that Chuck referred to with regards to how Part D was created, and Tom and I were in the administration, in the office of the secretary, working on at the time. Just the notice and comment process alone and the lack of notice and comment through the department. Andy references, input. What for any major change in law within the Department of Health and Human Services, you would go through a normal 90-day notice and comment process where you basically seek input from the public, obviously the patient community, obviously the industry, the provider community. And if you go through that process, and I'm sure Tom can comment on this as well, you basically seek comment because you are trying to work as partners in order to resolve issues that are more likely to be contemplated by those who are being impacted by the law than those who are going to be implementing it in general. And the fact that the IRA was handled through guidance, which is essentially 30 days, and really not having to listen to the public, is really, to me, is a black mark on the entire process. It basically demonstrates that the administration was not really open to getting input from stakeholders. And I think that's a major problem just in terms of how it's been perceived.
We wanted to hear from the public. When we went through a notice and comment process, the proposed Part D rule was issued in the summer of 2004, and we finalized it at the end of January 2005. We wanted to hear from the public. To pick up on Michael's word, we wanted to be partners with the PBMs, the Part D plans, with manufacturers, with pharmacies, with patient groups. We wanted to make sure that we got the design of the benefit correct. And it seems like with the IRA, the government doesn't want to hear from the public. They have their own fixed idea of how they're going to do this, and they deliberately, and Congress allowed them to deliberately short circuit the comment process.
Chuck, you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, I was just talking about prices that came up. Yeah, I would echo that. I think seeing the process, this was a deliberate choice. They do not want comments. They want to be able to execute the price controls as quickly as they can.
Dr. Potts, did you have any thoughts about what could fix the situation? Is there any middle ground here to refine things?
I mean, I think in the current political realities, I do think I'm optimistic that at least the 913, I mean, this insane, but really, frankly, killing off the small molecules for large populations, that I hope that there can be some fix there. And if I had one thing, that's what I'd focus on is moving the 913 to 1313 so that you have so that frankly, large population, small molecule drug development is sustainable.
Steve, one more thing I just want to add, and I think we heard this in some of the early presenters. I certainly have heard this as I've been out engaging with the HTA community and just generally with policymakers and stakeholders. You should look at this as a beginning of a bad law that's going to get worse. And so the idea that for those who are saying basically, we should be careful about how we implement this, and even those, I was referring to, I listened to a podcast yesterday from the Commonwealth Fund, who was basically saying we have to be very careful about the need for some guardrails because we don't really know how far this can go in terms of the impact that it has on innovation. That is an investment. There's dispute between the industry and the CBO in terms of the number of new drugs that might be affected by this. And, you really have to say, and I think it's one of the things that Thomas and I and those in the administration and Chuck, when he was on the Hill during the creation of Part D, you have to defer to the people that ultimately know best from where they're standing. So in this case, when you're talking about investment, you have to talk to the investors. You have to talk to the industry. They know better what is the impact is going to be. So it may be an unknown in that they don't know exactly how bad this can be. But at the same time, they know that they have to protect themselves. And that means they have to change their behavior. And ultimately, the number of molecules that may be affected, the different indications that may be, the degree of research that may be involved here, it's all bad. None of it is good. And I think that's the point. So those who support the law say, well, we don't think it's going to be quite as bad as others are saying, but they are acknowledging that it's going to be a problem. And ultimately, Andy's example of his own personal situation, and I can tell you that knowing Andy started the Colon Cancer Alliance back in the 90s because he lost a mother to colon cancer and a father to pancreatic cancer. And then he gave up his law practice and began doing what he's been doing since. And now he has a wife affected. So his story, his personal story is even more than he alluded to, but it is he is representative of millions and millions of people who basically could be impacted by these really bad changes to the law.
How would the panelists respond to the argument that is sometimes made that we need to try this to see what we can do to help control prices? Like, how do we know without trying this? Let's let it play out. If it undermines some innovation, the market will recover if we need to adjust things. And I'd be interested in what Dr. Potts and others might think about that approach.
I mean, I'll just quickly respond to that. I mean, if you look at, there was some examples. I mean, there's some great small molecules for lung cancer, for example, but that is it's a staircase, right? So you go back 2000 with a drug called Tarceva, which was the very first EGFR small molecule. It was good. It wasn't great. And it had lots of side effects, and nobody on this call would have said, that was the best drug ever. It's been amazing. But now it's 20 years later, and you've had the ability of investment year in and year out to continually make better and better lung cancer drugs. And so you look at Tagrisso now and some of the others that are just, they are amazing drugs, and you literally have very minimal side effects, and the quality of life is high, and the tumor is beaten back for a number of years. So that is a staircase, and that was a 20-year staircase in lung cancer. And I think what we were seeing prior to this IRA Act is those same staircases happening in pancreatic cancer, I hope in colon cancer, Andrew, to your, some of these other areas, myeloma. It's just been amazing to see the innovation. And what you're saying is, well, let's just experiment and eliminate some of those staircases for a decade and then see what happens. I mean, that's really what we're saying is like, is that really what we want to do?
Yeah, and I think, Steve, just to that point, and I know Steve Potts, your conversations with Dr. Fonseca and with McInerney, the former AMA president McInerney, they both talk about it as a system that is at its height in terms of what it's reaching a potential that is a separating factor for us in the U.S. and the advantages we have. You can look to Matthias in the European system, and they will acknowledge, I think, generally that basically the system that they would rather be under would be ours, what it was prior to the IRA. And from the patient community, the provider community, basically everyone but policymakers can't really make a logical argument as to why the system that they have now under and basically proposed and moved on very quickly with little input from the public is a system that has really any benefits other than cost savings. It's very much directed at cost. And the question is, where do those cost savings accrue? And it
isn't even true cost savings, because look at something like a bladder cancer. The cost of that disease is insane when you take, you get your bladder taken out, and drugs that prevent that. I mean, you can point to that drug, or you can point to so many costs that are avoided, hospitalization costs. But unless you take the totality of what the drug is doing, if all you do is look at what that drug costs versus what it was replacing and other costs.
Yeah.
I will flag just a concern I have on that, and this goes to a broader issue, that when we talk about cost, again, from a legislative lawmaker's perspective, and Tom will remember, all the decisions that Congress takes are going to be driven by the Congressional Budget Office. And while I absolutely agree and have argued over my career about the long-term value that medicines, and particularly either transformative or even curative therapies, offer, unfortunately, the framework that the Congressional Budget Office uses is a very narrow one, and it really looks primarily at what short-term expenditures are, and it doesn't take into account the long-term benefits to the healthcare system. The other part of it, going to the question of why I worry about this idea of, well, we can just turn it off if it proves to be bad, that what is going to happen with the IRA price control mechanism, every year that this goes forward, the baseline assumption for the Congressional Budget Office is more drugs are subject to negotiation, and more drugs there's going to be therefore more savings to the federal government. It's going to become harder and harder year after year to unwind that, particularly as you look ahead to the fiscal challenges facing this country, both in terms of the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, which pays for Medicare, is going to be insolvent in a handful of years. The overall debt numbers are staggering. That's only going to get worse, and that's going to put huge pressure on federal lawmakers to reduce spending, not increase it. And unfortunately, if we're talking about repealing or even mitigating the IRA, that's going to have a cost associated with it. And every year that this goes forward, that cost is going to get to be a bigger and bigger number, which is going to mean that it's going to be harder and harder to repeal.
That's a great point, Chuck.
The one of the issues that's been touched upon in the remarks today is the interrelationship between the European marketplace and the U.S. marketplace. And this analogy may be wrong, but I'll throw it out there. You know, our former administration famously approached NATO and said, you have to pay for more of your more fair share of our military defense costs. Is there a role here for our European allies to pick up more of the innovation costs if you know, our grandmothers in Iowa are going to be paying less, or whatever's going to happen because of some of these changes? Or can we expect things to change in that direction, or is everything moving towards less and less support for innovation?
We barely even take account for Europe when we do economic planning. It's literally the U.S. market. And then my other comment would be, it's like asking a library that gets books for free, you know, to somehow pay for more of the cost of actually producing them at a bookstore. The U.S. is the bookstore and Europe's the library. I mean, so it's going to be tough to get them to own up to, frankly, they're getting free books, and it's been great.
Mateus?
Thanks, thanks, Stephen. I think that's a very astute observation. I mean, the funding has to come from somewhere, right? And I think I also in my presentation I spoke about some of the recent changes we've seen in Europe as well, where there are increased pressures put on developers of innovative drugs. So you have those pressures in Europe, you have those pressures now in the US as well. And that's does not bode well for innovation, and that's a message that we are trying to put across here in Europe as well. So we are also involved in conversation here with WHO Europe. So it's the regional office of WHO, and they had set up a stakeholder consultation. It's called the Access to Novel Medicines platform, and we were in discussions here with the governments. They said, you know, what is the richer countries such as Norway, I'm Norwegian, said, well, we cannot pay for some of these new drugs. We think that they are too expensive. We challenged them on that and said, well, okay, but someone has to pay for these. Someone has to fund the development of these drugs in the first place, and it is only fair that those that have more of a willingness, ability to pay, they pay for it. And they did concede to this and said, well, that is actually true, and this actually shows some solidarity between countries, that those that have more of a willingness to pay are able to shoulder some of those costs. So to answer your question, I think, yeah, those pressures, they don't go away, and someone will have to shoulder the cost somewhere.
Yeah, and I'd like to just jump into that point, because after Part D was passed, and it was passed, for those who remember, basically it was signed December 8, 2003, but really started implementation in 2004, and it was a presidential election year. So there was a lot of pressure politically on, as we were working to define what Part D was. And I can say at the time that I had moved from the policy shop into the public affairs shop and was dealing with the media and the press a lot. And there were a lot of questions about, why are we paying more in the United States? There was questions around importation, as an example. Why can't we import drugs? There was questions about the fact that we pay more. And the reality was, the answer in general was, you know, we are basically carrying a lot of other countries. And at some point, nothing changed in the European system. Now is getting worse, right, Mateus, with what you guys just had come down your way in your own problems with regards to the system. And you're trying to struggle with, how do we maintain innovation to the extent that we are right now in Europe? Meanwhile, now we have those pressures with us on the US side. And so the question really becomes, well, where is it going to go? Because if we start replicating the European system, we already know the impact from where you guys are with access issues compared to us. And then you have to start looking outside of the US to what is a better environment to basically allow drugs to be developed where the manufacturers have to recover that cost that they're going to lose within the U.S. system. And eventually you're going to get squeezed out of being able to have that R&D and innovation anywhere, because the places where it exists right now, because of the fiscal pressures we've all talked about, there just aren't many options left. I keep hearing Asia as a potential place where it may go, where they may try to entice manufacturing. But obviously, it is a boon to the U.S. system. We haven't even talked on the economic side, but just from a patient perspective, it is an advantage that we've had that allows for stories like Andy's that certainly do not exist in the European system when you start thinking about quality and other aspects of HTA that gets into looking at systems and groups rather than individuals.
Well, I see where our time is just about up, so I wanted to thank everybody for participating today. I've certainly learned a lot, and a special thanks to all of our panelists, to the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, and to the Generics and Biosimilars Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.